The assignment. The telegram arrived on a cold February morning in 1944, its yellow paper trembling in Margaret Eisenberg's hands as she read the brief message. Assignment approved. Report to London office immediately. Life magazine. Margaret had been working as a photographer for 3 years, documenting the home front, capturing factory workers and war bond drives. But this was different. She knew what the telegram meant. After months of petitioning her editor, she was finally being sent to Europe, to the front lines where history was being written in blood and courage. Standing in her modest New York apartment, she looked at her reflection in the mirror. At 28, she had the determined jawline of someone who had fought for every opportunity in a field dominated by men. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical style, her brown eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore her brother David's Star of David on a chain beneath her blouse. He had been killed at Pearl Harbor, and it was her way of keeping him close. The journey to London took 2 weeks aboard a Liberty ship, zigzagging across the Atlantic to avoid German U-boats. Margaret spent the voyage preparing her equipment, checking and rechecking her cameras, 2 Leicas and a speed graphic. She had sewn extra pockets into her field jacket for film canisters, knowing that every shot would count. London was a city holding its breath. The bombed-out buildings stood like broken teeth against the skyline, and the streets were filled with soldiers from a dozen nations. At the Life magazine office near Fleet Street, she met her handler, Colonel James Morrison, a gruff Scotsman who had lost his left arm in North Africa. "Miss Eisenberg," he said, barely looking up from his maps, "you're being embedded with the 89th Infantry Division. They're pushing through France toward Germany. Your job is simple. Document what you see. The world needs to know what our boys are facing over there." But Margaret sensed there was more to her assignment. Whispers had been circulating among journalists about camps in Poland, stories so horrific that most dismissed them as propaganda. She had heard fragments through her contacts in the Jewish refugee community, tales of mass deportations, of people disappearing into the night never to return. Her editor in New York, Samuel Goldstein, had pulled her aside before she left. An Austrian Jew who had fled Vienna in 1938, he had gripped her shoulders with unusual intensity. "Margaret, if you see anything about what they're doing to our people, you document it. Every frame. Promise me." She had promised. The night before her deployment to France, she sat in a London pub with other war correspondents. Robert Capa was there, already legendary for his D-Day photographs. He leaned across the table, cigarette dangling from his lips. "Stay behind the infantry, Eisenberg. The story isn't worth your life." But Margaret knew that sometimes the story was worth everything. Her brother had believed that when he enlisted. She fingered his Star of David through her shirt and made a different promise to herself, to bear witness, no matter the cost. As she boarded the transport plane the next morning, her cameras heavy around her neck, she thought about the ancient Jewish principle of Eid, of testimony. In Hebrew school, she had learned that to witness was sacred, that sometimes seeing and telling were the most important things a person could do. The plane lifted off into the gray English dawn, heading toward occupied France. Below, the channel churned dark and restless. Margaret clutched her camera bag and thought about David, about the stories she'd heard from refugees, about the weight of truth in wartime. She didn't know that in 3 months, she would stumble upon something that would change her life forever. She didn't know about the gates she would walk through, the horrors she would document, or the powerful forces that would try to silence her. All she knew was that she had a job to do, to show the world what was real, one photograph at a time. The plane banked east toward the sun, toward the war, toward a truth that the world was not yet ready to see. Behind enemy lines. The French countryside in April 1944 was a contradiction. Spring flowers blooming in shell craters, birds singing between artillery barges. Margaret had been with the 89th Infantry for 6 weeks now, moving steadily eastward through liberated villages where grateful civilians pressed wine and bread into the soldiers' hands. She had learned to move like the infantry, quick and low, always aware of sight lines and cover. Her photographs from those weeks would later become iconic. a medic cradling a wounded German prisoner, French children playing on a destroyed tank, an exhausted GI sharing his rations with a stray dog. But these weren't the images that would define her legacy. The unit's commanding officer, Captain Richard Hayes, had initially been skeptical of having a female photographer embedded with his men. But Margaret had earned their respect by never complaining, sharing the same K rations, sleeping in the same muddy foxholes. She had even helped carry stretchers under fire during a particularly fierce engagement near Metz. It was Private Tommy Sullivan, a 19-year-old from Brooklyn, who first told her about the rumors. They were sharing a cigarette during a lull in the advance, watching the sun set over a bombed-out church. "My buddy in reconnaissance says they found something strange about 50 miles east," Tommy said, his young face troubled. "Labor camps, but different. The Krauts are burning documents, trying to cover something up." Margaret's pulse quickened. She had been collecting fragments of information for weeks. A Polish refugee speaking of trains heading east, a captured German officer's coded references to special facilities, a French resistance fighter's tale of camps where people went in but never came out. That night, she approached Captain Hayes with a request. "Sir, I'd like permission to accompany the reconnaissance unit tomorrow." Hayes looked at her over his map. "That's beyond our secured area, Eisenberg. Too dangerous." "The story's out there, Captain. Not here in the secured zones." He studied her for a long moment. "You remind me of my sister. Stubborn as hell." He sighed. "Fine, but you stay with Sergeant Mueller's squad at all times." The reconnaissance patrol left before dawn. 6 men and Margaret in a jeep and a half-track, moving through the morning mist in a territory that might or might not be secured. The Germans were retreating, but their retreat was chaotic, unpredictable. Pockets of Wehrmacht soldiers might be anywhere. 20 miles into enemy territory, they saw the smoke. It was different from battlefield smoke, thicker, greasier, with a sweet, sick smell that made Margaret's stomach turn. Sergeant Mueller, a tough career soldier from Texas, pulled out his binoculars. "There's some kind of installation 2 clicks northeast. Looks like the Germans pulled out in a hurry. Gates are open." As they approached, Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The complex was surrounded by barbed wire, with watchtowers at regular intervals. But it was the silence that was most unsettling. No birds, no insects, just the sound of their engines and that terrible smoke. The sign at the gate read, "Arbeit macht frei." Work makes you free. Inside the fence, Margaret saw her first evidence of the horror. Bodies stacked like cordwood, waiting to be burned. She raised her camera with shaking hands and began to shoot. Click! A pile of shoes, thousands of them, children's sizes mixed with adults. Click! A warehouse full of human hair, sorted by color. Click! The ovens still warm. But then they heard voices, weak, barely human. In a barracks that the Germans hadn't had time to destroy, they found them. Living skeletons, eyes huge in skull-like faces, reaching out with stick-thin arms. Some were crying, others were too weak to make any sound at all. Margaret kept shooting, tears streaming down her face, her camera the only barrier between her and complete breakdown. A man who might have been 30 or 60 approached her, speaking in Yiddish. She understood enough to make out the words, "Tell them. Tell the world." She nodded, unable to speak, and kept photographing. Sergeant Mueller was on the radio, calling for backup, for medics, for anyone who could help. But Margaret knew that no amount of help could undo what had been done here. As she changed her film roll with trembling fingers, she noticed something that would haunt her forever. A children's drawings on the barracks wall, pictures of houses with gardens, of families holding hands, of a world that no longer existed for them. She photographed those too, knowing that every image was evidence, testimony, proof of the unimaginable. The evidence. The camp, they learned, was called Dahlak, a subcamp of the larger Dachau complex. For 3 days, Margaret documented everything while the 89th Infantry struggled to provide aid to the survivors. The soldiers, hardened by months of combat, wept openly at what they found. Margaret worked methodically, forcing herself to maintain professional detachment even as her heart shattered with each frame. She photographed the crematoriums, the medical experiment rooms, the punishment cells. She documented the survivors, each face a testament to inhuman suffering and inexplicable survival. On the second day, she met Isaac Goldberg, a Polish doctor who had been in prison for 2 years. Despite his own skeletal condition, he was helping treat other survivors. He spoke English with a precise accent, his dignity intact despite everything. "You must understand," he told Margaret as she photographed him working, "this is not madness. This is system. Very organized, very efficient." They documented everything: who came, who died, how they died. They were proud of their work. He led her to an office the Germans had abandoned in their haste. Files covered every surface: transportation lists, execution records, medical experiment data. Margaret photographed page after page, using an entire case of film just on documents. "They killed my wife, my 3 children," Isaac said quietly as she worked. "But I survived to tell. You must help me tell." That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She sat outside her tent, developing film by lamplight, watching the images emerge in the chemical baths. Each photograph was a scream of evidence, undeniable and devastating. She had over 300 exposures already, and she knew she needed more. Captain Hayes found her there at dawn, still working. "Headquarters wants you back, Eisenberg. They're saying your work here is done." "It's not done," she said, not looking up from her developing trays. "There are more camps. The survivors are telling me. Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz. This is just the beginning. Orders are orders." But Margaret had learned something about orders in that place. She had seen what following orders could lead to. That morning, she made a decision that would change everything. She requested a meeting with Colonel Morrison, who had arrived to oversee the liberation efforts. "Sir, I need to follow the advance toward the other camps. This story, it's bigger than anyone imagined." Morrison looked at her photographs spread across his field desk, his face grim. "These are, Christ, Eisenberg, these are going to change everything. That's why I need to document more. One camp could be dismissed as an aberration, but if I can prove this is systematic." He was quiet for a long moment. "You're talking about going deeper into enemy territory. The SS is still active in those areas. They're destroying evidence, killing witnesses. Then I need to get there before they destroy everything." Morrison studied her. "You're Jewish, aren't you?" She lifted her chin. "Yes. If they capture you, I know the risks." He signed a paper and handed it to her. "Temporary attachment to the 42nd Rainbow Division. They're heading toward Munich and the camps in that region. God help you, Eisenberg." The next weeks were a blur of horror and determination. With the 42nd, she documented the liberation of 3 more camps. Each was worse than the last. At Kaufering, she photographed mass graves being uncovered. At Muldorf, she documented survivors so weak they died even as liberation came. But it was at a small camp near Landsberg where she found the most damning evidence. Hidden in a commandant's office, she discovered something the Germans had failed to destroy: a complete photographic record of the entire extermination process, taken by the SS themselves. Hundreds of photographs showing arrivals, selections, executions. The perpetrators had documented their own crimes. She knew immediately what she had found. This wasn't just evidence. It was irrefutable proof of systematic genocide. She carefully packed the German photographs with her own, creating a comprehensive record that no one could deny. Working through the night, she made multiple copies of everything, hiding sets in different places. She had learned not to trust single copies of anything. Too much could be lost, suppressed, or destroyed. As she sealed the packages of photographs, she thought about Isaac's words, "You must help me tell." She had over 1,000 images now: faces, places, documents, evidence. The weight of testimony pressed on her shoulders, but she carried it willingly. The truth was in her cameras, in her film, in the chemical smell of her developing solutions. Now she had to make sure the world would see it. The return. Margaret arrived back in London in early June 1944, carrying 17 rolls of undeveloped film and over 800 photographs in a locked ammunition case that never left her sight. She had lost 20 pounds. Her hands shook constantly, and she hadn't slept properly in weeks. At the Life magazine office, she was met not with enthusiasm, but with nervous silence. Samuel Goldstein, her editor who had urged her to document everything, wasn't there. Instead, she faced a panel of senior editors she'd never met before. Men in expensive suits who looked at her images with expressions of disgust and disbelief. "These can't be real," said William Hartley, the managing editor, a man known for his conservative politics. "The Germans are civilized people. This must be Soviet propaganda." Margaret's exhaustion flared into anger. "I took these myself. I have the negatives. I have supporting documentation from the SS' own files." "How dare you?" "Miss Eisenberg," interrupted another editor, Charles Worthington, "we're not questioning your integrity. But these images, they're too graphic, too disturbing. The American public isn't ready for this." "Ready?" Margaret stood, slamming her hand on the table. "People are dying in those camps right now, as we sit here debating what the public is ready for." The room fell silent. Finally, Hartley spoke again. "We'll run a selection. Edited, of course. Some of the liberation scenes, soldiers helping survivors. Nothing too extreme." Margaret felt the floor drop out from under her. "A selection? I risked my life for a selection." "You're emotional, Miss Eisenberg. Understandable, given what you've witnessed. Take some time off. Rest. We'll handle the publication." She was escorted from the building, her photographs remaining behind. The next week, Life ran a 6-page spread on the liberation of the camps. They used 12 of her photographs, the safest ones: soldiers giving food to survivors, liberated prisoners celebrating. Nothing that showed the true horror. Nothing that would disturb breakfast tables across America. But Margaret had anticipated this. She still had copies hidden in her apartment, including the SS documentation. She reached out to smaller publications, The Nation, Jewish newspapers, anyone who would listen. Some ran her photographs, but their circulation was limited, their impact minimal. Then came the visitors. The first was a man from the State Department who arrived at her apartment on a rainy Thursday evening. He was polite, soft-spoken, with the kind of forgettable face that belonged to men who worked in shadows. "Miss Eisenberg, your photographs are causing concerns at the highest levels. We're trying to win a war. These images could damage morale, create panic among Jewish American communities, even help German propaganda by making us look like we're exaggerating for effect." Exaggerating? Margaret couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Furthermore," he continued, "there are delicate negotiations ongoing about refugee resettlement, war crimes trials. Inflammatory images could complicate these efforts." When she refused to stop trying to publish her work, the pressure increased. Her press credentials were revoked. Life magazine terminated her contract for insubordination. Her apartment was broken into, nothing stolen except negatives. She started receiving anonymous phone calls, breathing on the other end, then hang-ups. Samuel Goldstein found her in a cafe near Central Park one evening. He looked older, defeated. "Margaret, I'm sorry. They made it clear, if I help you publish these, I'll never work in journalism again. I have a family. You told me to document it all. You said the world needed to know. I didn't know. I didn't understand how much they don't want the world to know. It's not just the magazines. It's the government, the military. They're saying it will complicate everything. The occupation of Germany, the refugee situation, even our relationship with the Soviets." Margaret looked at him with disgust. "So we just pretend it didn't happen?" "No, not pretend. Just control the narrative. A measured release of information. They're saying the full truth would be too much, too fast." That night, Margaret made a decision. If the American press wouldn't publish her work, she would find another way. She reached out to contacts in the international press, to Jewish organizations, to anyone who might help. But every door seemed to close before she could walk through it. Her photographs, her evidence, her testimony, all of it was being systematically suppressed by forces she couldn't fully see or understand. Underground networks. By September 1944, Margaret had become a pariah in mainstream journalism. Blacklisted from major publications, her bank account dwindling, she found herself in the basement of a synagogue on the Lower East Side, speaking to a small group of Jewish activists and refugees. "These are the photographs they don't want you to see," she said, projecting her images onto a makeshift screen. The audience gasped, some wept, others had to leave the room. Rabbi David Weinstein, who had organized the gathering, approached her afterward. "Miss Eisenberg, we've been trying to tell people for years. But without proof, they called us hysterical liars. Your photographs, they're the evidence we've been praying for." Through Rabbi Weinstein, Margaret connected with an underground network of Jewish organizations working desperately to document the genocide and pressure the government to act. She met Hannah Arendt, who was writing about totalitarianism. She worked with the World Jewish Congress, sharing her photographs for their reports. But even within these circles, there was fear. Many Jewish leaders worried that pushing too hard would increase anti-Semitism in America, would make Jews seem like troublemakers during wartime. One night, she met secretly with Jan Karski, the Polish resistance fighter who had tried to warn the world about the extermination camps 2 years earlier. "They didn't believe me," he said, his eyes haunted. "I told Roosevelt himself. I told your Supreme Court Justice. They listened politely, and then they did nothing. Your photographs, they prove I was telling the truth. But will it matter?" Margaret began making illegal copies of her photographs, distributing them through networks of refugees, resistance contacts, and sympathetic journalists in neutral countries. She learned to move carefully, to watch for surveillance, to never keep all her materials in one place. Then came the breakthrough she hadn't expected. A young Army sergeant named Bernie Kaufman, who had been at Dachau during the liberation, contacted her. He was Jewish, from Baltimore, and he had something she needed to see. They met in a diner in Brooklyn, Bernie constantly checking over his shoulder. "I was assigned to intelligence after the liberation," he said quietly. "Translating documents, interrogating prisoners. I found something." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were U.S. intelligence reports from as early as 1942, confirming the existence of extermination camps. The American government had known. They had known and chosen to do nothing. "There's more," Bernie said. "There are officers, high-ranking, who are already talking about using former Nazis for intelligence against the Soviets. They want this buried, Miss Eisenberg. All of it. Your photographs threaten their plans." Margaret felt sick. They knew, and let it happen. And now they want to control how the story comes out. Manage it. Use it when convenient, suppress it when not. She photographed Bernie's documents, adding them to her growing archive. But that night, walking home, she was followed. 2 men in dark coats, keeping pace behind her. She ducked into a subway station, lost them in the crowd. But the message was clear: she was being watched. The pressure intensified. Her mail was obviously being opened and resealed. Her phone clicked and echoed. Friends stopped returning her calls, frightened of association. But Margaret persisted. She connected with a Swiss journalist who agreed to publish some of her photographs in European papers. She worked with a documentary filmmaker who was trying to compile testimonies from survivors. She even managed to smuggle some images to Soviet publications, knowing they would use them for propaganda, but not caring. At least they would be seen. Then, in December, everything changed. Her apartment was ransacked, professionally, thoroughly. Not just her photographs this time, but her cameras, her equipment, even her personal photos of David. They left a message, typed on her own typewriter: "Stop now," or "Disappear like your pictures." She sat in her destroyed apartment, holding the only photograph of David they hadn't taken, the one she always carried. She thought about the survivors at Dachau, their eyes pleading with her to tell the world. She thought about Isaac saying, "You must help me tell." The next day, she went deeper underground. She moved in with a cousin in Queens, stored her remaining photographs in multiple locations, and continued her work. But she knew she was running out of time. The war was ending. Narratives were being written, and the forces trying to silence her were growing stronger. She had one last plan, one last attempt to force the world to see what she had seen. It would risk everything, but she had already lost so much. The truth, she decided, was worth whatever came next. The exhibition. In February 1945, using the last of her savings and loans from sympathetic supporters, Margaret rented a small gallery space in Greenwich Village. She worked at night, in secret, preparing what she called the exhibition they don't want you to see. She printed her most powerful photographs in large format, images that couldn't be ignored or diminished. She included the SS' own documentation, the intelligence reports Bernie had provided, testimonies from survivors she had interviewed. It was more than an exhibition. It was an indictment. 3 days before the opening, Colonel Morrison appeared at her door. He looked older, worn down by what he had seen and what he had been ordered to do about it. "Margaret, they sent me to stop you. Orders from very high up. They're prepared to arrest you under the Espionage Act if you go forward with this." She poured him coffee with steady hands. "Jim, you were there. You saw what I saw. I know. God help me, I know. But they're saying the war isn't over. That premature release of this information could affect military operations, peace negotiations." Premature? People are dying right now. How is truth premature? He was quiet for a moment. "They've prepared a cover story. If you proceed, you'll be labeled a communist agitator, possibly a Soviet agent. Your photographs will be called forgeries. They'll destroy your credibility so thoroughly that no one will believe anything you say. Let them try." Morrison stood to leave, then turned back. "They also mentioned your cousin in Queens. Her husband's business. His government contracts." Margaret felt cold. They were threatening not just her, but her family. That night, she called Rabbi Weinstein and her network of supporters. She told them about the threats, gave them the option to withdraw. Not one did. "If we don't stand up now," Hannah Arendt told her, "when will we?" The exhibition opened on February 20th, 1945. Word had spread through underground networks, and by noon, there was a line around the block. Veterans, refugees, journalists from small papers, ordinary citizens, they came to see what had been hidden from them. The reactions were immediate and visceral. People wept, vomited, fainted. Some accused her of fabricating the images. Others stood in silent shock, unable to process what they were seeing. But most importantly, they couldn't ignore it anymore. By the second day, mainstream journalists began appearing, unable to ignore the story. The New York Times sent a reporter. Time magazine sent a photographer to photograph the photographer's exhibition. Then, on the third day, the police came. They had a warrant. The exhibition was closed for disturbing the peace and displaying obscene materials. Margaret was arrested on charges of possessing and distributing classified documents. But it was too late to completely suppress the story. Too many people had seen. Copies of her photographs had been distributed to attendees. The underground networks activated, spreading the images further. At her arraignment, the courtroom was packed. The prosecutor, a stern man named Harrison Fuller, painted her as a dangerous radical who had stolen classified materials and was using them to undermine American interests. Her lawyer, provided by the American Jewish Congress, was a young woman named Ruth Bader, one of the few female attorneys in New York. "My client," Ruth argued, "is guilty only of showing Americans the truth about the greatest crime in human history. If that's illegal, then we need to examine what kind of democracy we're defending." The judge, looking uncomfortable, set bail at an amount Margaret couldn't afford. But within hours, donations poured in from the Jewish community, from veterans who had liberated the camps, from ordinary people who had seen her exhibition. While out on bail, awaiting trial, Margaret received a visitor she didn't expect. Edward R. Murrow, the famous radio journalist. "Miss Eisenberg," he said, "I've been following your story. I believe the American people deserve to know the truth. I want to do a broadcast about your photographs, about what you've documented." It was a risk for him too, but Murrow had built enough credibility to push boundaries. His broadcast, featuring descriptions of Margaret's photographs and her own testimony, reached millions of Americans. The response was explosive. Letters poured into Congress, demanding answers. Why had this been hidden? What else didn't they know? Suddenly, Margaret found herself at the center of a national controversy. The government's attempt to silence her had backfired, creating more attention than her exhibition ever could have. But she also knew that powerful forces were now fully mobilized against her. The trial was coming, and with it, the full weight of a system determined to control the narrative of the war's end. The trial. The trial of United States versus Margaret Eisenberg began on March 15, 1945, just as news came that American forces had crossed the Rhine into Germany. The prosecutors had chosen their moment carefully. Public attention was focused on victory, not on the horrors being uncovered in liberated territories. The government's case was simple. Margaret had stolen classified documents, violated wartime secrecy acts, and endangered national security. Prosecutor Harrison Fuller painted her as a hysteric, driven by emotion rather than patriotism. Miss Eisenberg, Fuller said during cross-examination, "Isn't it true that you're Jewish?" "Yes." "And isn't it true that your actions were motivated not by journalistic integrity, but by ethnic loyalty?" Ruth Bader objected immediately, but the damage was done. The prosecution was playing to prejudices, suggesting Margaret's work was biased, unreliable. They brought in military officials who testified that releasing such images during wartime could demoralize troops, inflame tensions, and complicate military objectives. They brought in psychologists who claimed the American public would be traumatized by such imagery. But Ruth Bader had prepared carefully. She called survivors to testify, those who had made it to America, who could speak to what Margaret had documented. Isaac Goldberg, the doctor from Dachau, had somehow survived and made it to New York. He took the stand, his dignity unshakable despite Fuller's aggressive questioning. "These photographs," Isaac said, looking directly at the jury, "are not just images. They are evidence. Evidence of systematic murder. Without them, you would not believe. Even with them, you struggle to believe. But they are true." Ruth then did something unprecedented. She requested permission to show Margaret's photographs to the jury. Fuller objected furiously, but the judge, perhaps feeling the weight of history, allowed it. The courtroom was silent as the images were displayed. Several jurors wept. One had to be excused. The court stenographer stopped typing, staring in horror. Then came Margaret's testimony. She spoke for 3 hours, describing everything she had seen, everything she had documented. She explained how she had found the SS' own photographic records, how she had confirmed every detail. "I did not steal classified documents," she said firmly. "I documented a crime against humanity. If that's illegal, then the law itself is criminal." The most dramatic moment came when Ruth Bader introduced a surprise witness, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. He had just returned from inspecting liberated camps himself and had been horrified by attempts to suppress information about them. "I saw what Miss Eisenberg photographed," Eisenhower testified. "I made my own staff visit, so they could never say it didn't happen." These images are not just journalism. They're historical documentation of the highest importance. His testimony changed everything. The prosecution's case began to crumble. Public opinion, already shifting, turned decisively in Margaret's favor. But the government had one last card to play. On the final day of testimony, Fuller introduced evidence that Margaret had shared some photographs with Soviet publications. "The defendant," he declared, "gave aid and comfort to our ideological enemies. She chose communist propaganda over American interests." It was a desperate move, but in the growing anti-communist atmosphere, it had impact. Some newspapers began questioning Margaret's motives. Was she a communist sympathizer? A Soviet agent? During closing arguments, Ruth Bader delivered what would later be considered one of the great legal speeches of the era. This trial is not about Margaret Eisenberg. It's about truth itself. It's about whether we, as a democracy, have the courage to face the darkest realities of our time. My client's only crime was refusing to let genocide be hidden, refusing to let murder be sanitized, refusing to let truth be silenced. Yes, she shared her photographs widely, because our own government wouldn't. She tried every legitimate channel first. She went underground only when forced. She sought any outlet for truth only when her own country's press was closed to her. You've seen the photographs. You've heard the testimonies. You know what happened in those camps. The question before you is simple. Is documenting genocide a crime? Is revealing truth treason? Is conscience criminal? If you convict Margaret Eisenberg, you convict every journalist who refuses to be silenced, every witness who insists on testifying, every citizen who believes democracy requires truth. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Margaret waited, knowing that everything, her freedom, her life's work, the truth itself, hung in the balance. On March 30th, 1945, the verdict was read, not guilty on all charges. The courtroom erupted. Margaret collapsed in her chair, overwhelmed by relief and exhaustion. She had won, but at tremendous cost. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded her. "What now, Miss Eisenberg?" She looked at them, thinking of all she had lost, her career, her savings, her sense of safety in her own country. "Now," she said, "we make sure this never happens again. And we start by never forgetting what did happen. The silencing. The acquittal should have been vindication, but Margaret quickly learned that legal victory didn't mean freedom. Within days of the trial's end, she discovered just how thoroughly she had been blacklisted. No major publication would hire her. Her photographs, despite their historical importance, were quietly excluded from official military archives. When victory in Europe was declared in May 1945, the celebrations felt hollow to her. The full truth of what had been defeated was still being suppressed. She tried to publish a book of her photographs. Publisher after publisher rejected it, not because they doubted its importance, but because they feared the controversy. One editor told her privately, "Margaret, the country wants to move on. They want to celebrate victory, not dwell on horror. And frankly, there are people in Washington who have made it clear that publishing your work would have consequences." As 1945 turned to 1946, the world's attention shifted to rebuilding, to the emerging Cold War, to moving forward rather than looking back. The Nuremberg trials were happening, but they were distant, legalistic. The visceral truth of Margaret's photographs was deemed too raw, too dangerous for public consumption. She supported herself by taking wedding photographs, portraits, commercial work, anything to pay the bills. The woman who had documented history's greatest crime was now photographing birthday parties and bar mitzvahs. But she never stopped trying to get her real work seen. In 1947, she received an unexpected visit from a man she recognized, one of the government agents who had threatened her before the trial. He looked older, grayer. "Miss Eisenberg," he said, sitting uninvited in her small studio, "the world has changed. We're recruiting German scientists now. Operation Paperclip, though you didn't hear that name from me. Some of them worked at the camps. Your photographs, they complicate things." "Complicate?" She laughed bitterly. "You're hiring the murderers? We're fighting the Soviets now. We need their expertise. I'm here to make you a final offer. Stop trying to publish your work, and we'll restore your press credentials, get you a position at a major magazine. Continue and—" He shrugged. "And what? You'll kill me? Nothing so dramatic. But you'll find life increasingly difficult. Your cousin's husband has already lost his contracts. Your elderly parents in Chicago. Did you know the IRS is auditing them? These things can get worse, or they can get better." After he left, Margaret sat alone in her darkroom, surrounded by the images that had defined and destroyed her life. She thought about the survivors who had begged her to tell their story. She thought about Isaac, about all those who hadn't survived. That night, she made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She began distributing her photographs and negatives to trusted friends and institutions around the world: universities, Jewish organizations, foreign archives. She created dozens of copies, hiding them like seeds that might someday grow into truth. Then she held a small press conference announcing her retirement from photography to focus on personal matters. The threats against her family stopped. Her parents' audit was dropped. Her cousin's husband got his contracts back. But the price was her silence. Margaret Eisenberg lived another 30 years, until 1975. She never married, never had children. She taught photography at a small community college, lived quietly in a modest apartment in Queens. But those who knew her said she was haunted, that she never recovered from what she had seen, and from being forced to stop bearing witness to it. Only after her death were her photographs fully revealed. Her executor, following instructions left in her will, released the complete archive to major newspapers, museums, and the newly established United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. The images that had been suppressed for 30 years finally saw light. Today, Margaret's photographs are considered among the most important documentary evidence of the Holocaust. They're exhibited worldwide, taught in schools, used in trials of war criminals. But few people know the price she paid to create them, or the decades-long fight to suppress them. In her private papers, discovered after her death, she had written, "They silenced me, but they couldn't destroy the evidence. Truth is patient. It can wait. And someday, when I'm gone and can't be heard anymore, when my family is safe from retribution, these images will speak the words I was forbidden to say." I kept my promise to Isaac, to all of them. I helped them tell. It just took longer than any of us imagined. To those who come after, who see these photographs in freedom and safety, remember, this is what happens when the world looks away. This is what happens when truth is deemed too dangerous. This is what happens when we choose comfortable lies over difficult realities. Never again, but only if we remember. Only if we have the courage to see. Epilogue. In 2003, Margaret Eisenberg was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. The citation read, "For extraordinary courage in documenting history's darkest chapter and for preserving truth despite overwhelming opposition." At the ceremony, Isaac Goldberg's daughter, who had been born in a displaced persons camp after the war, accepted the medal on Margaret's behalf. "She gave us our history," she said simply. "She gave us proof when the world wanted to forget. She paid the price for truth." Today, Margaret's complete archive is freely available online. Her photographs have been viewed by millions, becoming part of humanity's permanent record. The forces that tried to silence her ultimately failed. But her story reminds us that truth is often unwelcome, that bearing witness requires not just courage in the moment, but the strength to endure the aftermath. And that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with cameras, with evidence, with an unwavering commitment to ensuring that never forget is more than just words. Margaret Eisenberg died, believing she had failed. History proves she succeeded beyond measure. Her photographs speak still, across decades, a testament to both humanity's capacity for evil and one woman's determination to make the world see it. The truth, as she knew, could be delayed but not destroyed. And in the end, it was the silence that was temporary, while her images became eternal.